The room was quieter than it should have been for a war that claimed millions of lives. Inside the Allied headquarters, maps lay spread across long wooden tables, their edges curling under the weight of constant use. Pins marked positions that were already outdated by the time they were placed. Telephones sat idle, not because the war had slowed, but because no one wanted to be the next voice to speak. Outside, engines rumbled in the distance, the low mechanical heartbeat of an army that refused to rest. Inside, a single realization had begun to settle. Something was happening faster than the plans allowed. Dwight D. Eisenhower stood over the main map, hands resting flat against Europe. The lines drawn in grease pencil were meant to represent order, phase lines, supply limits, boundaries of responsibility. They were supposed to impose logic on chaos. Yet one arrow had already crossed two lines it wasn't meant to touch for another 48 hours. It was bold. It was dangerous. And it was unmistakably Patton. The order had been clear. Advance. Then consolidate. Secure the flanks. Wait for coordination. No commander in the room misunderstood that. And yet, the reports coming in from the front told a different story, a story moving too quickly to be neatly rewritten. Columns were already beyond their assigned limits. Fuel trucks were running on borrowed time. Recon units were reporting enemy positions that intelligence insisted should still be organizing. Somewhere beyond the edge of the map, George S. Patton was doing what he had always done, moving first, explaining later. Eisenhower had known this moment would come. He had built his command structure precisely to prevent it. Coalition warfare demanded balance, British caution, American momentum, political restraint layered over military necessity. Patton did not fit easily into that equation. He never had. He treated war not as a series of permissions, but as a race against hesitation. And races, Eisenhower understood, were dangerous things when too many people were watching. A staff officer stepped forward, holding a thin folder. The paper inside was smudged with dirt and sweat, delivered straight from the front. Eisenhower didn't look up immediately. He already knew what it would say. Distances covered faster than projected. Resistance lighter than expected. German units caught mid-movement, unprepared. The kind of success that created its own problems. When he finally took the report, his eyes moved slowly, deliberately, as if speed itself might tempt him into a mistake. This wasn't the order, someone said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Eisenhower nodded once. He didn't disagree. The plan had not called for this. The plan had not accounted for a commander who believed momentum was a weapon more powerful than artillery. He glanced again at the map, tracing the arrow with his finger. Every mile gained now would demand fuel, protection, explanation later. Every mile lost, if Patton were stopped, would be one the Germans would never give back cheaply. The phones began ringing again. Not all at once. One line at a time. Reports layered over each other. Bridges taken intact, towns bypassed rather than secured, prisoners stunned by the speed of the advance. German units, trained to react to predictable tempo, were being forced to improvise. That was Patton's real weapon, not tanks or guns, but time stolen from the enemy before they knew it was gone. Eisenhower straightened, removing his glasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, the faint ache behind his eyes a reminder of the weight he carried. Supreme Commander was not a title of glory, it was a burden of restraint. He could rein Patton in. He had the authority. The paperwork would support him. The British would expect it. The staff would breathe easier. But the front would slow. And in war, slowing at the wrong moment could be fatal. Another officer spoke, carefully choosing his words. Supplies were stretched. Flanks were exposed. If the Germans regrouped, Patton's spearhead could be cut off. It was a reasonable concern. Eisenhower listened without interrupting. He had heard these arguments before, many times, often from men who were right, just not right now. He looked again at the map. At the distances already covered. The enemy formations are still scrambling to respond. at the narrow window that existed only because Patton had ignored the spirit of the order, while technically obeying its letter. Eisenhower understood something then that no report could fully capture. Stopping Patton would not restore control, it would surrender initiative. Silence returned to the room. The decision hovered, unspoken but heavy. Everyone waited for Eisenhower to say the words that would bring Patton back into line. To remind him who commanded whom. To restore the war to something predictable again. Instead, Eisenhower exhaled slowly. "That wasn't the order," he said at last. The room stiffened. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it was, he added quietly, "But let him continue." No one spoke. No one moved. The words settled like a shockwave. Eisenhower had not endorsed Patton's disobedience, he had absorbed it. He had taken responsibility for momentum that could no longer be undone. From that moment forward, whatever happened next would not belong to Patton alone. It would belong to the command that chose not to stop him. Outside, the engines kept moving. And far ahead of the lines on the map, Patton's columns drove on, unaware that the most important decision of the night had just been made behind them, a decision that would reshape the next phase of the war, and test whether speed itself could be controlled once unleashed. But within hours, a new report would arrive, one that would force Eisenhower to confront the true cost of letting Patton continue. The report arrived just before midnight, delivered by a courier whose boots left streaks of dried mud across the floor. He looked exhausted, not from running, but from understanding what he carried. Eisenhower watched him enter, watched the way he hesitated before stepping forward, as if instinct warned him this information did not belong in a quiet room. The folder was thicker than the last. That alone was troubling. Eisenhower opened it without ceremony. Patton's spearhead had moved even farther than anticipated. Another town was bypassed. Another bridge was seized intact. Enemy units were not merely retreating, they were dissolving. German officers were surrendering without waiting for orders. Entire formations were being discovered in the wrong place, oriented toward threats that no longer existed. The reports used a word Eisenhower disliked deeply: uncontrolled. Momentum, when it exceeded the plan, stopped being an advantage and became a liability. Fuel levels were now the first concern. Not shortages, exhaustion. Patton's advance had outrun scheduled resupply by nearly 2 days. Tank crews were cannibalizing disabled vehicles for fuel. Truck drivers were sleeping behind the wheel. Engineers were blowing bridges behind the advance not because it was required, but because they didn't know how else to slow the enemy pursuit. Patton was winning, but he was doing it on borrowed time. Eisenhower closed the folder slowly. Around him, the staff waited again, their expressions tight, no longer confident. Earlier hesitation had been replaced with calculation. How long could this last? How quickly could victory become a disaster? A British liaison officer cleared his throat. He spoke carefully, diplomatically, but the meaning was unmistakable. Montgomery's sector was stalled. Supplies were being redirected south, unintentionally favoring Patton's advance. The coalition balance Eisenhower had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to tilt, and tilt created resentment. Resentment created fractures. Fractures were dangerous in war. Eisenhower absorbed the words without reaction. He had anticipated this too. Success rarely arrived alone, it brought consequences behind it like a shadow. Patton's speed was not just altering the battlefield, it was reshaping relationships, expectations, egos. And once those shifted, restoring them was far harder than advancing a few more miles. Another officer spoke. German radio traffic had changed tone. Panic was being replaced by urgency. Units were being pulled from quiet sectors to counter Patton specifically. Not the front, Patton. His name was appearing in intercepted transmissions more frequently than any other Allied commander. The enemy was no longer reacting to Allied strategy. They were reacting to one man. That realization unsettled Eisenhower more than the supply reports. He had always feared this moment, the moment when Patton ceased to be an instrument of command and became a gravitational force of his own. Wars were not won by personalities alone. They were won by coordination, by restraint, by discipline. Patton respected none of those when speed offered an alternative. And yet, Eisenhower also understood something few men in the room could fully grasp. Fear traveled faster than armor. The Germans were not afraid of Allied numbers, they had faced those before. They were afraid of unpredictability, of commanders who did not pause where doctrine said they should, of advances that made maps irrelevant. Patton was doing that now. The phones rang again. This time, Eisenhower answered personally. The voice on the other end was clipped, urgent. German units were regrouping ahead of Patton's lead elements. Not in strength, in desperation. Anti-tank guns were being rushed forward without proper support. Defensive lines were being improvised rather than prepared. It was sloppy. It was dangerous. And it was exactly the kind of chaos Patton thrived in. Eisenhower thanked the caller and hung up. He walked back to the map. The arrow had moved again. He stood there longer this time, staring at it, not as a commander but as a student of consequence. Every inch gained now pulled the war tighter, like a rope stretched to its limit. The question was no longer whether Patton could continue. It was whether the war could absorb the speed without tearing itself apart. A junior officer, younger than most in the room, spoke hesitantly. What if Patton didn't stop even if ordered? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable but honest. Patton had obeyed before, mostly. But he had also ignored instructions when he believed the moment demanded it. Authority, Eisenhower knew, only mattered when it was enforced. And enforcement had a cost. Eisenhower sat down heavily, the weight of the decision finally settling into his shoulders. He could pull Patton back now, while success still masked the danger. He could preserve supplies, appease allies, restore symmetry to the front. Or he could let momentum burn itself out, fast, violent, decisive, and hope the enemy collapsed before the risks matured. He thought of previous wars. Of commanders who had hesitated at the wrong moment and paid for it in blood. Of victories lost not to defeat, but to caution disguised as wisdom. Eisenhower had always prided himself on balance. Tonight, balance felt like surrender. The room waited again. Eisenhower lifted his pen and began writing, not an order, a condition. A message that would travel to the front without urgency, without emphasis. Words chosen not to restrain Patton, but to observe him. Continue advance, he wrote, pending further evaluation. It was not a command to stop. It was not permission to accelerate. It was something far more dangerous, silence. The staff understood immediately. Eisenhower was no longer directing Patton's movement, he was watching it, prepared to intervene only if the consequences became irreversible. Responsibility remained, but control had loosened. In war, that was a gamble few commanders dared to make. Outside, somewhere in the dark, German officers were making their own calculations. Maps were being redrawn hastily. Orders contradicted each other. Units were being sent to face an advance that no longer followed the rules they had trained to counter. And Patton kept moving. By dawn, a new message would arrive, one that would force Eisenhower to decide whether speed had crossed the line from weapon to liability, or whether stopping now would be the greatest mistake of all. Dawn arrived without ceremony, gray and cold, as if the sky itself refused to take sides. Eisenhower had not slept. He sat exactly where he had been hours earlier, the map unchanged except for the pencil marks that now felt less like planning tools and more like warnings. Overnight, Patton's advance had not slowed. It had accelerated. New reports arrived one after another, each confirming the same impossible truth. German resistance was collapsing ahead of Patton's columns, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had been bypassed, confused, and psychologically broken. Units were retreating in the wrong directions. Supply depots were being abandoned intact. Commanders were issuing orders that arrived too late to matter. This was no longer a breakthrough. It was a dislocation. Eisenhower read a field report twice, then a third time. A German battalion had surrendered to a reconnaissance unit, not tanks, not infantry in force, but scouts. When questioned later, the captured officers gave the same explanation. They believed Patton's main body was already behind them. They were wrong. But fear had made accuracy irrelevant. Fear, Eisenhower knew, was now the dominant force on the battlefield. The phones rang again. British headquarters this time. The tone was no longer diplomatic. Montgomery's staff was furious. Supplies earmarked for the northern sector were arriving late or not at all. British commanders felt exposed, not by the enemy, but by an ally moving faster than coordination allowed. Eisenhower listened without interruption, absorbing the anger, the implication, the unspoken demand. They wanted him to stop Patton. When the call ended, Eisenhower did not respond immediately. He rose and walked to the window. Outside, trucks idled, engines humming, carrying men who believed the war was being steered with precision. He wondered how many of them would feel differently if they knew how close command was to improvisation. Stopping Patton now would be simple. One order. Clear language. Immediate compliance. Probably. But Eisenhower understood something that could not be written into directives. Momentum, once broken, could not always be restored. German forces were bending under pressure, not yet shattered. If Patton slowed, they would recover. If they recovered, the cost of resuming the advance would be paid in blood. Yet letting Patton continue meant accepting risks that no responsible commander should tolerate. Supply lines stretched thin. Flanks exposed. Units operating beyond supporting distance. One coordinated German counterattack, properly executed, could sever the spearhead and trap thousands of men deep in hostile territory. Eisenhower had planned his career on preventing exactly that scenario. Another message arrived, this one from American intelligence. German high command communications showed confusion bordering on panic. Orders were contradictory. Authority was breaking down at multiple levels. One intercepted transmission described Patton's movement as unnatural, a word that unsettled Eisenhower more than any tactical assessment. When the enemy began attributing momentum to something beyond strategy, morale was already cracking. Still, Eisenhower hesitated. He had lived long enough to know that disasters often masqueraded as victories just before they unfolded. Every instinct told him to slow the advance, reassert control, realign the front. Every other instinct, quieter, harder to justify, told him that history was unfolding faster than command could manage, and interference now might be the wrong lesson learned at the wrong moment. He sat again and asked for Patton's latest situation report. It arrived quickly. Patton's message was short, almost dismissive. He reported minimal resistance, accelerating surrender rates, and continued exploitation of enemy confusion. He requested no additional supplies, no reinforcements, no permission. The final line was almost casual. Situation favorable. Recommend continuation. Eisenhower stared at the words. There was no arrogance in them. No defiance. Just confidence, the kind that unsettled superior officers more than open rebellion. Patton was not asking to break the rules. He was acting as if they no longer applied. That was the moment Eisenhower understood the true nature of the decision before him. This was not about Patton anymore. It was about command itself. About whether centralized control could coexist with battlefield intuition when speed created opportunity faster than bureaucracy could respond. He picked up the phone and dialed his chief of staff. "What happens," Eisenhower asked quietly, "if we let him go another day?" The answer came carefully. German forces might collapse further. Or they might consolidate and counterattack. Allied coordination might fracture. Or it might become irrelevant if the enemy broke first. There were no guarantees. Only probabilities. Eisenhower thanked him and hung up. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, sharper now. Decision had arrived not as certainty, but as acceptance of consequence. He reached for his pen again. This time, the order was clearer. No restriction. No recall. No warning. Just one line. Advance authorized. When the message was sent, the room fell silent. The staff understood what had just happened. Eisenhower had crossed a line few supreme commanders ever did. He had allowed initiative to outrun oversight, not because it was safe, but because stopping it might be worse. Somewhere ahead, Patton would receive the message and interpret it exactly as Eisenhower expected. As permission. By nightfall, Patton's columns would move again, faster, deeper, and farther than any Allied plan had predicted. The German command would scramble to respond. Allied leadership would argue. Supplies would stretch. Risks would multiply. And Eisenhower would wait. Not for reports of success, but for the first sign that momentum had turned into something he could no longer control. By the second night, the war no longer resembled the maps in Eisenhower's headquarters. The neat arrows had dissolved into something far more dangerous, motion without symmetry. Patton's advance had stretched so far ahead of adjacent units that the concept of a continuous front had quietly collapsed. What remained were corridors of movement, narrow and exposed, driven forward by speed and belief rather than protection. Reports now arrived faster than they could be digested. Towns were falling without engagement. Bridges were seized before demolition teams reached them. German rear echelon units were surrendering to forces they believed were only the vanguard of something much larger. They were wrong, but the illusion was enough. Panic filled the gaps where intelligence once lived. Eisenhower read the same phrase repeatedly in the field summaries: enemy resistance disorganized. At first, it sounded promising. Now it sounded unstable. Coalition pressure intensified. British headquarters demanded an explanation. Not clarification, explanation. Montgomery's staff argued that Patton's movement had forced British units to cover ground they were never intended to hold alone. Supply priorities were becoming political weapons. Fuel allocation was now a diplomatic act, not a logistical one. Eisenhower listened, said little, and absorbed everything. He had anticipated rivalry. He had not anticipated velocity. The problem was no longer Patton's defiance. That had passed. The problem was that success itself was creating obligations. Every mile gained required justification. Every town captured demanded protection. Every German unit bypassed remained a potential threat. Speed had stolen time from the enemy, but it had also stolen margin for error from Allied command. That margin was vanishing. Another intelligence report crossed Eisenhower's desk late that evening. German communications showed something new. Not confusion, adaptation. Orders were consolidating. Units were being pulled from secondary fronts. The enemy was no longer chasing Patton's movement. They were planning to cut it. Eisenhower leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. He had waited for this moment, the point at which German command would stop reacting and begin choosing. That was always the danger of allowing momentum to run unchecked. Eventually, the enemy would identify the vulnerability not as a mistake, but as an opportunity. Patton's columns were long now. Too long. Fuel trucks moved day and night. Infantry rode tanks. Tanks outran their own artillery. Engineers worked under fire to keep bridges intact. There was brilliance in it, undeniable brilliance, but brilliance did not insulate against overextension. A message arrived from a corps commander operating on Patton's flank. The tone was cautious, professional, but unmistakably worried. His units could not keep pace. If Patton continued at this speed, the flank would not exist, only space. Eisenhower folded the message slowly. For the first time since authorizing the advance, doubts surfaced, not about Patton's ability, but about Eisenhower's restraint. Had he confused boldness with inevitability? Had he mistaken enemy collapse for enemy defeat? He stood and walked again to the map. What struck him now was not how far Patton had gone, but how alone he was becoming. There was a knock at the door. A senior officer entered, carrying fresh intercepts. German radio traffic indicated the movement of armored reserves. Not toward the British. Not toward static fronts. toward Patton. This was it. The moment every commander feared. The enemy had stopped bleeding and started aiming. Eisenhower felt the weight of command press down harder than before. If Patton was cut off, history would not care about intentions or probabilities. It would remember only that the Supreme Commander allowed it to happen. He reached for the phone, then stopped. Calling Patton back now would take time. Slowing an advance already in motion was not instantaneous. Orders would travel slower than tanks. Confusion would follow. The enemy would exploit hesitation just as easily as speed. And Eisenhower knew something else now, something uncomfortable. Patton had anticipated this. Every report hinted at it. Units repositioned instinctively. Routes chosen not just for speed, but for escape. German counterattacks met resistance that was already braced, already waiting. Patton had not simply charged forward. He had prepared for the moment when momentum would be tested. That realization complicated everything. Because if Eisenhower intervened now and Patton survived anyway, the lesson would be catastrophic for command discipline. And if Eisenhower intervened now and Patton failed, responsibility would still belong to him. There was no clean outcome left. Only ownership. Eisenhower closed his eyes briefly. Then he made a decision, not to issue an order, but to wait. One more set of reports. One more confirmation. One more hour. Outside, the war moved on without him. And far ahead, Patton's spearhead drove toward a narrowing corridor of resistance, unaware that German armor was already shifting into position, and that the next dawn would decide whether speed had won the war's most dangerous gamble, or exposed it. Dawn arrived without drama, which in war was often the most alarming sign of all. There was no thunder of artillery, no sudden surge of air activity, no massed movement visible from reconnaissance photographs. The battlefield looked deceptively calm. Too calm. German doctrine rarely announced itself. It concealed intention until contact made denial impossible. Eisenhower sensed it before the reports confirmed it. The silence was deliberate. The first warning came from aerial reconnaissance just after sunrise. Columns of armor had been sighted moving at night, engines muffled, headlights blacked out, using secondary roads that bypassed Allied surveillance corridors. They were not rushing. They were positioning. German commanders were doing something they had not done in weeks. They were choosing where to fight. By mid-morning, radio intercepts confirmed the pattern. Orders were concise, disciplined, focused. The chaotic desperation of retreat had hardened into controlled resistance. German armored reserves were not trying to stop Patton everywhere. They were converging on one place. Patton's axis. Eisenhower received the consolidated intelligence summary standing at the map table. He did not sit. He did not speak. He simply read and understood. This was the moment that defined campaigns. Not when breakthroughs happened, but when the enemy decided whether they could be exploited. German command had concluded that stopping Patton mattered more than holding terrain, more than protecting cities, more than maintaining appearances. They were willing to risk everything to sever his advance. And that meant Patton was no longer just a general advancing faster than planned. He was now the focal point of the enemy's remaining strength. A liaison officer entered with updated casualty projections. If Patton was cut off, not encircled, just delayed, fuel shortages alone could immobilize entire armored divisions within 48 hours. Artillery would lag. The air cover would thin. Infantry would fight isolated. The spearhead that had terrified the German rear could become a stationary target. Eisenhower finally sat down. The weight of command is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, like gravity suddenly remembered. Every calculation now carried moral weight. The lives at stake were no longer abstract numbers but known formations, known commanders, known men. He thought of the phrase he had spoken 2 nights earlier. That wasn't the order. At the time, it had been a boundary. Now it felt like a warning he had failed to enforce. The phone rang. It was Bradley. The conversation was brief but urgent. Bradley had seen the same intelligence. He did not question Patton's skill. He questioned exposure. He argued for consolidation, for pause, for aligning the front before the enemy struck. His tone was not political. It was protective. Eisenhower listened. When the call ended, Eisenhower remained still. The map in front of him now told a different story than it had days earlier. What once looked like bold momentum now resembled a blade extended too far without a shield. And yet, another report arrived, this one from Patton's headquarters. It was not a request. It was not defensive. It was observational. Patton's staff noted enemy movement but described it without alarm. Units were already adjusting routes. Engineers were preparing fallback crossings. Tank destroyers were repositioned to counter anticipated armor approaches. Patton was not surprised. He had expected the enemy to choose him. That realization landed harder than Eisenhower expected. Because it meant Patton had already made his peace with the risk, and had proceeded anyway. Not recklessly. Not blindly. But deliberately. Speed had been the weapon. Now speed was the bait. German armor made contact by afternoon. Not head-on. Probing. Testing. Small engagements flared and vanished. Patton's units responded fluidly, shifting axes, refusing decisive engagement, pulling the enemy deeper into stretched positions. Reports described German commanders hesitating, unsure whether they were facing a spearhead or a trap. Eisenhower read every word. This was not luck. This was doctrine improvised at the edge of collapse. Still, the danger remained absolute. One miscalculation. One bridge was lost. One fuel convoy was destroyed, and the entire advance would unravel faster than it had formed. Late that evening, Eisenhower stood alone again. The headquarters had quieted. Lamps glowed low. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping softly against windows like distant gunfire. He reached for the phone. This time, there was no hesitation. When Patton's voice came on the line, it was calm. Almost casual. The sound of a man already moving, already adjusting. Eisenhower did not lecture. He did not argue. He asked one question. How long can you hold them if they commit fully? There was a pause, not long, but deliberate. Long enough, Patton replied. If you let me keep moving. That was the moment. Not when Patton disobeyed. Not when Eisenhower allowed it. But when both men understood that stopping now would be more dangerous than continuing. Eisenhower closed his eyes briefly, then spoke. Keep going, he said. But don't outrun your shadow. Patton did not reply with gratitude. He did not acknowledge permission. He simply said, understood, and the line went dead. Eisenhower placed the receiver down slowly. Outside, the rain intensified. And somewhere ahead, German armor rolled forward to meet an advance that no longer obeyed timetables, expectations, or doctrine, only momentum and belief. The gamble had entered its final phase. The German counterstroke came without announcement. No declaration. No dramatic surge. Just pressure, applied everywhere at once, probing, grinding, searching for weakness the way water finds cracks in stone. Their remaining armored reserves did not rush forward recklessly. They advanced with calculation, commanders knowing they were no longer fighting for victory, only for control of collapse. Patton's forward units felt it first. Fuel convoys came under attack along narrow roads. Bridges were targeted not for destruction but for delay. German armor refused decisive engagement, instead forcing Patton's spearheads to maneuver constantly, burning fuel faster than it could be replaced. The advance did not stall, but it strained. Eisenhower watched the reports stack up through the night. Each update narrowed the margin for error. The question was no longer whether Patton could advance faster than planned. It was whether he could advance faster than the enemy could adapt. And for the first time, Eisenhower understood something unsettling. If Patton stopped now, the Germans would not retreat. They would entrench. Pausing would give the enemy exactly what they needed, time. At dawn, Eisenhower convened his senior commanders. There was no speech, no rhetoric, just maps and numbers. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when everyone already knows the stakes. Some argued for restraint, others for consolidation. No one argued that Patton was wrong, only that the risk had grown too large to ignore. Eisenhower listened to every voice. Then he spoke. "We are past the point of clean options," he said. "If we slow him now, we give the enemy a line. If we pull him back, we give them confidence. If we let him continue, we accept uncertainty." He paused. "I choose uncertainty." The decision was not recorded as dramatic. No aide noted raised voices or slammed fists. It appeared in orders as a continuation, not an escalation. Logistics were redirected. Air support was prioritized. Flank units were told to hold, not advance, so Patton could keep moving. The machine adjusted itself around momentum. German commanders sensed the shift almost immediately. They had expected hesitation. They had counted on Allied caution, on bureaucratic delay, on the instinct to protect gains rather than risk them. Instead, they faced an enemy who refused to slow even when the cost increased. Reports from German staff officers captured the confusion. Allied units did not behave predictably. Their spearhead did not wait for consolidation. Their logistics adapted in motion. Their command structure did not fracture under pressure, it compressed. Patton was not outrunning his support. His support was reorganizing to keep up with him. Within days, the German counterattack lost coherence. Units meant to trap Patton instead found themselves outpaced, forced to react rather than dictate. Bridges Patton crossed were still intact when German demolition teams arrived. Towns assumed safe for regrouping were already occupied. The enemy had chosen where to fight. Patton had chosen when. And timing proved decisive. Eisenhower received the decisive confirmation late one evening. German resistance along Patton's axis had collapsed not because it was destroyed, but because it was bypassed. Entire formations found themselves irrelevant, holding ground no longer central to the war's outcome. The breakthrough was no longer local. It was operational. Eisenhower stood at the map again, but this time the lines no longer looked fragile. They looked irreversible. The gamble had not merely succeeded, it had redefined the pace of the war. Later, alone, Eisenhower allowed himself a moment of reflection. He thought back to that first report. The one that said Patton was ahead of schedule. The one that should have triggered correction. He realized something then, something uncomfortable and profound. Command was not about enforcing plans. It was about knowing when to let them break. Patton had not disobeyed out of ego. He had not advanced for glory. He had moved because he sensed the enemy's balance failing, and understood that hesitation would allow it to recover. Eisenhower had seen the danger, and chosen to accept it. That night, he wrote a brief note. It was not intended for history. It was not circulated. It was simply a personal record of a moment when restraint would have felt safer, and proven fatal. The war would later be remembered for its grand conferences, its declarations, its dramatic victories. Few would speak of this night. Fewer still would understand how close momentum had come to being surrendered to caution. But history pivoted here. Not with a shouted order. Not with a public argument. But with a quiet sentence spoken into a telephone. Keep going. Years later, when asked about Patton, Eisenhower would speak carefully. He would acknowledge brilliance, temperament, difficulty. But those who listened closely heard something else beneath the words. Respect. Not for defiance, but for judgment. Because that night, Eisenhower did not lose control of the war. He chose not to strangle it. The war did not end that night. There were no parades the next morning. No headlines announcing what had happened. In fact, very few people understood that anything unusual had occurred at all. The front continued to move, orders continued to flow, and the machinery of war pressed forward as it always had. But something had changed. The Germans felt it first, not as defeat, but as inevitability. Intercepted communications in the weeks that followed showed a subtle shift in language. Less talk of counteroffensives. More discussion of delay, withdrawal, preservation. Commanders who had once spoken in terms of regaining initiative now spoke only of managing collapse. Patton's advance had not shattered the German army outright. It had stolen their belief that time was on their side. For Eisenhower, the moment passed quietly. He did not revisit the decision publicly. He did not frame it as a gamble or a turning point. In official histories, it became just another adjustment in an evolving campaign. But privately, he never forgot it. Years later, when Eisenhower reflected on command, he spoke less about authority and more about judgment. About knowing when discipline preserved strength, and when it strangled opportunity. He understood that leadership was not the rigid enforcement of control, but the careful release of it. Patton, for his part, never spoke of the night at all. He continued forward as he always had, relentless, impatient, convinced the war could be ended faster if commanders simply refused to slow down. He did not frame his actions as disobedience. In his mind, he had not broken orders. He had fulfilled intent. That difference mattered. Because Patton did not see command as obedience to words. He saw it as obedience to reality. The irony is that both men were right and wrong in different ways. Patton's instincts were extraordinary, but his temperament made him dangerous. Eisenhower's caution preserved alliances and prevented catastrophe, but it sometimes threatened momentum. That night, they met in the narrow space where instinct and restraint overlap. And history turned because neither insisted on being right. After the war, the legend grew and warped. Patton became the embodiment of aggressive warfare. Eisenhower became the calm architect of Allied victory. The truth was more complicated. Eisenhower won not because he suppressed strong personalities, but because he knew when to trust them. Patton succeeded not because he ignored authority, but because he understood the cost of hesitation. The war ended months later. The surrender documents were signed. The maps stopped changing. The guns fell silent. But the most important victories had already been decided long before, in moments like this one, where the outcome hinged not on firepower, but on judgment. No monument marks the night Eisenhower let Patton continue. No plaque records the moment restraint gave way to momentum. Yet every mile gained afterward carried the weight of that choice. Years later, when Eisenhower stood as President of the United States, he warned against the dangers of rigid systems and unchecked power. He had seen firsthand how systems fail when they refuse to adapt, and how power becomes useless when it cannot respond to reality. That lesson did not come from theory. It came from war. And from one night when the safest order was the wrong one. History often celebrates boldness. It rarely acknowledges restraint, especially the restraint required to step aside. Eisenhower's greatest strength was not command over armies, but command over himself. Patton's greatest contribution was not speed or aggression, but the ability to sense when the enemy had lost balance, and to move before they could recover. Together, they demonstrated something rare in war. Trust. Not blind trust. Not emotional loyalty, but professional faith, grounded in understanding. That is why the order was never written. Why did the moment pass without ceremony? Why history almost missed it? Because wars are not won only by those who push hardest, but by those who know when to let momentum breathe. And on that night, when Eisenhower said nothing more than keep going, he did not surrender control. He exercised it.